Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great delight to see so many of you here in soggy Cambridge. All I can do is apologise for the weather of the Fens, but it will get better sometime next May. Now, I have great privilege to talk a little bit about the book that I've been working on with my wonderful colleagues Fiona Costello and Sarah Fraser-Butlin. And it's a rather unusual book, and it's very unusual for me in particular to talk and work on socio-legal material, i.e. what actually happens to people when they exercise their rights to free movement. Now, you might remember that in the referendum campaign, a huge amount of attention was paid to migrant workers, and the narrative was invariably they're either taking our jobs or taking our benefits. And I've been funded by the ESRC since 2016, in part to do public engagement about Brexit, but also in part to do research projects. And I've been looking at migration in all sorts of forms since then. We've been looking at, for example, whether migrant workers actually are undercutting the locals for their jobs, to which the answer is basically no, but they're not enforcing their rights. And we've also been looking at whether migrants are actually exploiting the social security system, to which the answer is there's very little evidence. But this part of the project, and what we've been going to talk about today, is actually about the experiences of EU migrant workers on the ground. Now, when you think about EU migration, particularly for those of us working in universities, you think about wealthy people, professional people, multilingual people going to other countries and working there, being immensely successful, contributing to the economy. But there's been almost no attention paid at all to the low-skilled, low-paid migration. And that's the group we wanted to look at. And what we wanted to do was to see what their experiences were on the ground. In order to do that, we focused on the town of Great Yarmouth. And it's a town, I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's an extraordinary town. It used to be an incredibly successful seaside resort, but it's now a town which can politely be described as on its uppers, or on its downers perhaps, because it's at the bottom of every league table that you might want to consider. And into that town came a large number of EU migrant workers. And we followed their stories, and Fiona's going to tell you how we did it, and why we did it, and what we found. And so what we're going to do this afternoon is Fiona's going to tell you some of their stories and some of what we found, and which led to the book. And then Charles Clarke is going to offer comments. So those of you not familiar with Charles, most importantly for my purposes was that he was my parents' MP and thus MP for Norwich, and thus knows the area, in particular Great Yarmouth, really well. When he wasn't doing that, he was Home Secretary, and so he has some thoughts on the legal system and on the law and how we talk about law. And he's going to offer some comments on that. And then we're going to open the floor to questions. I've been asked by way of housekeeping to tell you that this event is being recorded, that during the Q&A, this will also be recorded. There will be some roving microphones. And if you do speak into the microphone, please could you make sure the microphone's right up against your mouth so it is possible to hear, and so that those who are listening remotely can hear as well. And then there are drinks afterwards. I say grandly there's a book signing. That makes it sound far more high level than it is, but there's some copies of the books outside, and there is also leaflets which give 50% off the books. In this day and age of modern publishing, the publishers only ever print 15 at a time. So I've been going around scooping up as many copies of our book as possible, which may mean that we get to the bottom of the bestseller list very, very briefly, just because there's been one person buying it, and it's not been my mum. Anyway, on that note, I would like to hand the floor over to Fiona, who's going to talk about what we've been doing in Great Yarmouth.
Okay. Fabulous. Okay. Hi, everybody. So thank you all very much. Before we move to the panel discussion, as Catherine said, I will briefly provide an overview of the book's journey, the kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end. So what we said we would do, what we did, and then also what we found. So thinking about the beginning and what we said we would do. As Catherine mentioned, we were funded by the ESRC to undertake a 3-year research programme with the aims to consider the lives of migrant workers living in the town of Great Yarmouth during the turbulent time of Brexit and then unexpectedly also of COVID-19. We were interested in their lived experiences, what sorts of legal problems they were facing, how they were being created, and how they were being resolved. And how they were being resolved in the everyday, often through the use of community-based advice service. And to look at this part of the research problem, we had a research partner called Gyros, who are a community-based advice service based in Great Yarmouth and have been since 1998. And I'll describe them briefly as well. So thinking then, they were our research questions, how did we answer them? So we undertook a number of research strategies to ensure we were able to speak to a wide cohort of EU nationals living in the UK, in Great Yarmouth, and also to professionals working in the town who were supporting these groups. And I'll briefly provide a little bit more of an overview of the empirical work that we did undertake. So firstly, we undertook focus groups and interviews with those living in the town. And for the focus groups and interviews, Gyros were able to provide language support because most of the EU nationals that we worked with were unable to speak English. The stories from the focus groups and from the interviews are spread throughout various chapters. Some focus groups were delineated by nationality. So, for example, we had Portuguese-only focus groups because they're one of the larger groups, which I'll return to also. And some were delineated by working sector. So we had a number of focus groups talking to just those who were working in local chicken factories. Secondly, we did some ethnographic work, the kind of house, the street, the town of the book title. On your screen, you have beautiful Great Yarmouth on a lovely sunny day, not like today's weather, and you can see in the corner what the locals refer to as the Yarmouth Eye. Great Yarmouth, as Catherine said, is an interesting place to think about migration and about Brexit. It was the 5th highest leave vote in the UK referendum to leave the EU nationally. It has also seen significant migration post-2004 EU member states. And we looked at, based on comparing ONS data for the town with more recent EU settlement scheme data, we can see almost a 200% increase in the migrant population, which gives you an idea of kind of the rhetoric that was about during the referendum. The increase in migrant workers was driven largely by local employers in the region who needed workers. Our interviews showed people mostly didn't come over to Great Yarmouth to take jobs, but rather to accept jobs they'd already been offered or promised in their country of origin. The street of our book title is this, St. Peter's Road, that you can see on your screen now. It's a street in one of the more central wards of Great Yarmouth and is in fact one of the most deprived wards nationally by any metric. And there's another lovely picture of St. Peter's Road. And then finally, the house of the book title is a HMO, a house of multiple occupation, which was located just off St. Peter's Road. I lived in this HMO for 2 months with 8 EU nationals, all from Lithuania and Latvia, all of whom had been previously or were currently working in chicken factories. I was able to spend time with the other tenants as a housemate, to interview all of the tenants for the book, and also to interview the landlord. So we have some pictures here on your screen of the house itself. You can see this is the shared bathroom on the ground floor, which was shared between 3 residents. You can see kind of significant black mold, a little bit on the top screen of the ceiling there. The window didn't open. There was a crack down the middle, so it was unable to be opened, and there was significant kind of green moss growing alongside the inside of the window. Various bits of the house were unfinished, so you can see here near that bathroom there's a back staircase, and there's a sign saying construction site, please do not enter, which was holding the spare shower curtain for the bathroom at the time when I was living there. And then this is the room that I stayed in. So the entire house had no central heating. Each of the rooms had one of these plug-in heaters. The room that I was staying in also didn't have any electricity, which is why you can see the extension lead on the bed there to try and funnel some electricity underneath. Despite the outward appearances of the house, all of the tenants spoke very highly of their experiences of living in this house. And I think in all of the interviews, those people said that this house was an improvement on previous houses that they had lived in since they'd moved to Great Yarmouth. Finally, as I said, we also worked with an advice charity called Gyros, and working with the charity, we were able to access a download of Gyros dataset covering the time period 2015 to 2020. This allowed us to take a longitudinal analysis of about 6,500 case notes of people that they were helping and what issues, and enabling us to see what issues people were bringing to Gyros' door. What was interesting to us as we examined this data was A, how many of the problems were legal problems that were being brought to Gyros' drop-in, and B, Gyros' role in helping people to navigate and resolve those problems. Gyros offer pragmatic, practical problem resolution, often there and then at the drop-in, but none of their advisors are legally trained. And we will come back to the approach of Gyros at the end again. So to give there's some pictures of Gyros in action. To give a little bit of a flavour of who are the clients that Gyros are seeing, we've got an overview here on the screen. So about 86% of the clients in their original data set said that their English language skills were limited, very limited, or none, which isn't surprising as they're accessing a multilingual advice service. And about 60% rating their IT skills as less than 5 out of 10. This was very important at the time that we were undertaking the research because the Home Office had rolled out the EU settlement scheme, which was, of course, a digital first and English language only application. So you can see the majority of Gyros' clients already were going to struggle at the first hurdle to make their application. About 60% of those in the dataset were women, and this was the trend that carried right through all of the empirical work that we did. We saw and spoke to more women than men. And a median age of 45, which again is slightly older than some of the literature you'll see about kind of young, healthy migrant workers that are coming over to work. Finally, in terms of nationalities, the two largest groups that Gyros are working with are Portuguese and Romanian nationals. Portuguese is an interesting data set to look at because within the Portuguese nationals, there's about a 50-50 split of those who are Portuguese from Portugal and those who are Portuguese as they lived in previous colonial countries. So there's a large Mozambican, Angolan, Guinea-Bissau, East Timorese population also living in Great Yarmouth who are Portuguese nationals by descent. And also within the Romanian population, the second largest group, there's also a large number of self-identified Roma Romanian nationals that Gyros are working with. An interesting point about the Gyros data is that it shows that people are often experiencing multiple and intersecting problems at once. And here we can see 4 of the most commonly clustered problems that people are experiencing and bringing to Gyros' door. And I don't think it would surprise anyone to see that cluster, and you can see how one of these problems would lead into another. But it has an impact on Gyros' service provision, as they often act as a one-stop shop, helping clients with all of these issues at once. So this is different to traditional legal specialization where you might have a family law problem, you go see a family lawyer, a criminal law problem, you go see a criminal lawyer. In the book, each of these headings are distinct chapters, but as you read through, you can see the interplay of all of these issues that people are bringing to Gyros' door and through our interviews also. To give a further example, I've just prepared kind of one snapshot of one of the clients of the data set that we worked with. The book features lots of representations of the voices and stories of interviewees throughout. But for the purposes of today, we have a client who we have named Irina. She is a 55-year-old mother of 2. She came to Gyros experiencing problems across a number of issues, tax credits, debt, her son's health, her own health as well. The case notes say that the client came in with a full bag of unopened envelopes from various utility companies, debt collectors, council, etc. The Gyros advisor, asked why she had ignored the letters, and she said, because I don't understand them, and I was also wrongly advised that I didn't need to do anything about them because I already pay my rent and I was told my utilities are included. The client also mentioned that she is suffering from a low mood and lack of motivation following the bereavement of her husband. The case notes show that Gyros undertook intensive work with Irina over the next 6 months, negotiating various payment schedules with the various utility companies, but it also shows that this process was slow. The case notes show Irina was unable to answer some of the security questions due to her limited English, and this slowed down the process. Her debts increased when she missed further payments and further late payment charges were added. She also had various summons letters that needed to be dealt with and court fees that were added to her already existing debts that she was struggling with. Alongside all of this work, Gyros was also continuing to help Irina with appointments for her health around her eyesight and her mental health, and they were accompanying her to these appointments to bridge the language gap as well. They were also helping her to navigate the UK school system, including assisting her older child to register for a secondary school place. So you've brought in this example because it's quite a good example of the intensive and multi-directional work that Gyros are doing at any one time with clients that are coming through their door, as well as the challenges that clients are facing through English language barriers and also issues with digital-only applications of various things. So moving to the end and kind of some of our findings. Firstly, I think a common thread throughout the whole book is that of precarity. For example, precarity in employment, people working in zero-hour contracts or through agencies, or in housings with landlords who are not fulfilling their legal obligations, like the house that I stayed in in the HMO. This precarity means it doesn't take much for things to go wrong and for that cluster of legal problems to surface. And the experiences of EU nationals in low-paid work in the book and their everyday precarity that they're facing highlights a less documented side of EU free movement. And finally, the last thing I'd like to discuss before the panel is that of a pragmatic law, which is a term that we eventually landed on to describe the work that Gyros was doing in this space. And I'll explain what we mean by that. So we tried to locate Gyros in this reimagined pyramid showing a potential legal problem resolution pathway with the higher courts at the apex of the pyramid, and then down the bottom of the pyramid here, maybe you go see family, friends, or someone in your church group, presuming that the people in this group are not legally trained. So we placed Gyros just above this level towards the lower section of the pyramid. Because equally, Gyros staff are not legally trained, but nevertheless, through the data, we can see that they are navigating complex legal issues, often, although neither party might label them as such as housing law, employment law, welfare benefits, etc. Gyros's approach is to support people with their legal problem resolution often at source. And what we mean by this is that they will get on the phone to an employer, or they will go with you to the GP, or they will go with you to the housing office to try and get your problem resolved. This early advice kind of role of filtering out legal problems, i.e. they help people resolve their problem before they need to go further up the pyramid, or trying to filter people up the pyramid so that they can have their legal problem resolved, is what we call pragmatic law. So why does Gyros's approach and pragmatic law matter? Firstly, it allows us to understand the legal needs of a vulnerable and marginalised group who are not interacting with any other service. What problems people bring to Gyros's door tells us something of what legal problems people are experiencing, although Gyros, of course, do not see everyone, we accept it as not a full picture. But nevertheless, in the access that they do have, they play an important role in helping vulnerable, marginalised community to access justice and their rights and entitlements. This pragmatic approach could be argued to prioritise individualistic problem solving rather than more systemic issues, but legal pathways are not necessarily any less individualistic either. Following on from this, Gyros also play, as I said, an important role in filtering out problems where they can, but also in filtering up problems where they recognise somebody needs to travel further up the pyramid, often hand-holding people into services and providing language support. But an important caveat here is you need to be able to recognise a legal problem in order to be able to escalate it. And you also need to have the other services available to you, so for free legal advice services, locally to have somewhere to refer people to. And unfortunately, this isn't always the case either. Linked to this, the early advice that Gyros offer in resolving legal problems also then raises questions around transparency and quality control. Gyros are accredited voluntarily for their advice service, but others are not, and we do know of advice sharks also operating in the same space. So if Gyros and other advice organisations like them do hold a role in this kind of legal advice ecosystem as we've imagined it, then it raises questions around how this can be regulated in the future. So we possibly raise as many questions as we answer in setting out our approach to pragmatic law, but I will leave it there for now, and we can move to the panel discussion, hopefully pick up some of these issues. So thank you very much, everybody.
Catherine, you very generously asked me to participate in this panel, and I was really honoured to do so. I should, in full disclosure right at the beginning, saying that I'm a long-time friend and admirer of you, not in the wrong sense.
Do you want to go use the microphone?
Is it okay sitting from here, or would you prefer to go? Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll stay here, thank you. And admire of your work. And as you know, we've worked together for a very long time in relation particularly to EU political and legal questions. I knew you were doing the work in Great Yarmouth because you told me. I knew, of course, about the family history in Norwich, where I was a Member of Parliament, Norwich South. But when I read this book, I was absolutely knocked off my feet, and I wholeheartedly commend it. And I thought, Fiona, your presentation just now was absolutely excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Why did I feel that? As a Member of Parliament, like most members of Parliament, I have had constituency surgeries every week or so, and people with all kinds of problems in the constituency would come to the surgery. And they were looking for for solutions to their problems. Many of them were in a very desperate state, and many of them really had no idea where to go in solving their problems. There were two often remarks that were made, to which I had a relatively standard response. One was, we'll take it to the media. And I always advise them not to do that, since in my experience, people who go to the media in those circumstances, against the hospital, against the police, whoever it is, who'd maligned them, the media picked them up and spat them out and threw them back. And the people who actually made the complaint in the first place had a very unsatisfactory experience by going down that route. The other one, which led to my being so interested in this book, was people said, we'll go to law and to take legal action to try and deal with our problem. And not universally, as with the media, but in a large number of cases, I ended up advising them not to do that, because I was very doubtful whether they would actually get a resolution to their particular problems, which was satisfactory. The process took a great deal of time. It was very inaccessible. It was potentially very expensive. Not always. There are a number of free services that apply. And there are organisations like Gyros in many parts of the country, and certainly in Norwich, who could help. But nevertheless, it was a very long and uncertain process, to put it mildly, in terms of solving the problems. And I very much like the idea of pragmatic law, which Fiona's just explained. And of course, when I was Home Secretary, I thought about this as well. It's a bit bizarre that this is what I'm saying to constituents in these circumstances. But I don't think it was an unfair or wrong thing for me to say, actually, though it's obviously a point for discussion. Because what you've got, and the book summarises the enormous existential questions which this deals with. Your legal status and identity, your employment, your housing, your income, welfare benefits and debt, your access to healthcare. These are the titles of the book, the chapters in the book. They are absolutely central questions. And if you can't solve those problems for you or your family in your particular circumstances, you really are in a situation where how do you live? How do you survive? What do you do? What are the circumstances? And that word you just introduced, Fiona, precarity, is a good word from that point of view. But I could certainly say as Member of Parliament that there were a large number of people who came to my constituency surgeries in Norwich who were living in precarious situations, and their ability to survive. They were desperate in very many ways. Obviously, the MP might be able to help. My office could perhaps help. It was often the case, actually, that a letter from a Member of Parliament did, wrongly really, bypass the system as a whole. If the letter from the MP went to the relevant institution, the hospital, the health service, the police, or whatever, then they would get special attention, as it were, validating the idea that going to see your MP was the way to solve your problem. But I didn't certainly think that was a good way of doing it. So that had been my experience. And when I read the book, what you three have done in this book is to chart out very, very, very powerfully the limits of law in its ability to solve the actual real life and death is an exaggeration, but almost the precarity problems that people experience. And of course, the big question for anybody who's got any of these problems with their identity, with their employer, with their home, with welfare benefits, whatever, is can the law help them solve their problems? And the assumption of the political system is that it can. So if you pass a law in Parliament, that will actually solve the problem that you're trying to address. And the institutions, the courts and so on, will do their very best to uphold the law in the way that it's coming through. But in fact, the reality, and it's charted so starkly here, is that the law was not effective in enabling many of these people to solve their problems. Nobody was saying don't go to law. Gareth, it sounds from what you're saying, and the other advisors were saying you should try and use the law to make it work, but were sceptical about whether it would succeed in dealing with these problems. And I think this is a massive question for, certainly for politics, but also for the legal system and for the university here in terms of law as to how you deal with these things. They're very important questions in law which are quite grand. How you make your case in front of the Supreme Court, how you deal with particular criminal or civil issues and how they're taken through, how you deal with fraud, the basic issues that are dealt with. But in every city in Britain, there are parts of communities which are going through the kinds of things that you describe in this book. Not only, I should say that I think this is wider than simply the questions of low-paid EU migrant workers. There are a whole group of people who are in the position where they're living in precarious circumstances, but who aren't actually low-paid EU migrant workers, but for whom I think the conclusions of this book apply very, very deeply indeed. And that's why I think the book both makes a tremendous contribution. And I said to Catherine when I'd first read it, this is an enormous contribution. We need more of this kind of thing to understand how we approach the problems that are there. It has a massive political importance in terms of how does the political system adjust to dealing with the law, the fact that the law is not really assisting people deal with their problems. And so simply passing the law won't solve the problem. And it has massive implications for the legal system about how fast it can operate and how effectively. One of the most extraordinary things of August was the set of legal actions taken around the so-called riots. I wouldn't myself call them riots, but the actions that took place, where government was able, I think using Keir Starmer's experience as a former DPP, to generate a very rapid response to many of the disorders that there were, and a proper legal hearing and a sentencing consequent on that, which had a massive impact on the way that people operated their lives. I think it's a very interesting discussion how that happened so quickly in so many different ways. I know it was controversial. Some people might think it was over rapid what was done, and that's obviously a serious discussion to be had. My observation would be that people seeing the law actually being applied and operated and carried through had a massive impact on the wider society, as police people believed there was a rule of law that applied. Now, if you said the same for sweatshops and working arrangements and applying the law in many of the places that you're describing here, or to housing or whatever, again, it would transform society. So the question is, how does one move that forward and take it on? So, Catherine, that's why I was, as I say, honoured to be asked to contribute to the panel. I support your approach tremendously, that it's necessary to look at it in this way. And I'll only add one slight comment, which is there's a former permanent secretary of a senior government ministry in the UK who retired to Cambridge and gives advice to the Citizens Advice Bureau in Cambridge. He told me the result of doing CAB cases with people had transformed the way he thought about his role as a former permanent secretary in making law and how it applied, because he's a very, obviously very intelligent and a very focused man. He said, actually, when we were making laws in the areas he was dealing with, there were knock-ons about the way law did or didn't have an impact on people's individual lives, which doesn't really feed into the way government takes its decisions about either what laws to have or how to implement those laws which it came through. And that was a kind of third element, my own experience as a Member of Parliament with my constituencies, this individual's experience working in a CAB here, and then the very fully documented account in this outstanding book, which I hope will give people cause to think more seriously about what we do to make this less accurate a description of life.
Thank you very much indeed for those very helpful comments. I'll let you applaud if you agree with this. Do either of you would like to comment at all, Fiona?
No, just thank you very much for those comments. I think certainly, just thinking about the CAB and what you said, CAB also featured, we did interview them in the book also, and we put the CAB kind of at a level slightly above JARS because they do have access to legal advice, maybe not at a local level, but at a national level. But they are quite an important part of the landscape in Great Yarmouth as well, actually.
And I'm conscious this is also a Cambridge Women in Law event, and I think that's something that we also pick up in our book, that there were some very particular issues for the women who we met and interviewed. If I can just give a couple of examples. In the chicken factories, there were very specific times when the women and anybody could go to the toilet. And there were very difficult issues for women who were menstruating who needed to use the loo. And there were problems in that interaction with supervisors, and it was a very female problem. Similarly, there was often accounts of sexual harassment in the factories, or if you refused a relationship, or then you wouldn't get the shifts that you needed. And so for women particularly, their vulnerabilities became very apparent as we met and talked with individuals.
I think it's also just picking up on that. It was striking that more of the people we interviewed were women. It was the women who actually came forward and volunteered to participate in the focus group. We are, of course, an all-female research team, and of course that brings its own issues. But also, I can see that some members of the law faculty very kindly attended. Of course, there were ethical issues for us doing this research, not least about putting Fiona into a house which probably wasn't very safe. I can rest assured we did have ethics approval for all of this, but nevertheless, it was a challenge in respect of the particular safety issues. But there are also ethical issues about us as, to be frank, privileged researchers going into very underprivileged backgrounds with our own, of course we come at it with our own baggage, and of course there's further issues about language because we don't speak Latvian, Lithuanian and so forth. And so some of you might be thinking, well, doesn't that fatally undermine your research? I would say in response to that it's obviously something we thought long and hard about. And the advantage about working with Gyros was that all of their staff have come on the same migration journey as those they are now advising. And so understood what it was like to be dumped in a grotty former hotel or in a caravan on your first night in Great Yarmouth before being taken to a chicken factory at 4 o'clock in the morning and then just essentially told to get on with it. They understood the implications and the vulnerabilities of the people who were brought largely by agents from Lithuania and Latvia. But those staff, having lived that and now working for Gyros, of course, had the language skills and were able to act as translators. Of course, it's not perfect to use translation, but our view is ultimately fundamentally pragmatic. It's important to get some of these stories out there and to describe something that certainly in my own teaching, I have not explained to the students. Now, one of the good things that Cambridge is doing, and Nobel is here, is to work with the Law Corner to try and give students some experience of a very different way of doing law, and that most of the world, and with great respect to the distinguished lawyers in this audience, most of the world are not looking up to the Supreme Court, but their experiences on a day-to-day basis of what the law does to them is actually quite damaging. And I think this point that Fiona made about the fact that if you're poor and you get into debt, your debt is compounded by the fact that there are fees being charged by the courts and there's interest being charged, all of which exacerbates the situation of precarity. And yes, the CAB does a good job, but the CAB is locked into their online manuals. And the problem is that the CAB, because of their own insurance concerns, have to refer back to the relevant paragraphs of the relevant online manual. And so what they're not able to do is to offer that flexible, holistic advice that you see at the lower level. And that's where Gyros is doing a good thing. Now, I wouldn't say that Gyros is unique, but of course, we've only been able to look at one particular area and one particular organisation with such intensity. But I hope it tells a story of what life is like for this particular cohort we're looking at. And rather unexpectedly for us, what we also started to look at was how Gyros responded to those problems for which the literature just doesn't really focus on or doesn't currently address. There's lots of literature on access to justice, but actually the cohort we're looking at don't want to go to the courts at all, because for them the courts are an expense, they're a threat, and of course they also take a very long time to address their particular issues. And so they want quick and easy solutions to their problems, and that's what we're seeing at that bottom level of the pyramid, and that's what we're trying to describe in the book. Now, you very helpfully said, what about going to your MP? So what's interesting about Great Yarmouth is that the MP for a long time has been a Conservative, Brandon Lewis, who played a major role in the Brexit debate, and of course served in a number of very senior government positions. So he was around very little in Great Yarmouth. And indeed, we used to go past his offices, and what always struck us was just how run down they were. It was quite clear that nobody was ever in there. There was always piles of post inside the letterbox. And subsequently, Great Yarmouth, in the elections in July, elected a Reform MP, Rupert Lowe, who you might have come across because he has been very public about, one, not taking his salary, which he's giving to various local causes, but two, it's been interesting to hear from Rupert Lowe because he is focused very much on combating criminal gangs in Great Yarmouth. Well, we've interviewed the police and they say there isn't evidence of criminal gangs. He also wants to close down the Asylum Hotel because he says they are the cause of the trouble. And indeed, Great Yarmouth Borough Council successfully sought an injunction to stop any more hotels from being converted into asylum reception centres. But in fact, the police also tell us they have had no problems whatsoever with the Asylum Hotel. They thought they would, but they have had no problems whatsoever. And indeed, Gyros, to their enormous credit, provided work for the people in the asylum hotels, unpaid, because of course the asylum seekers were not allowed to be paid. But the advantage for Gyros was that they had some very good people who wanted to work. And for the asylum seekers, it gave them an opportunity to work, to improve their English and have referees so that they could apply for jobs when they got asylum, which most of them would do because most of them were from Eritrea, where there's a 95% chance of getting successfully getting refugee status. So that's a bit more background. Charles, do you want to say anything else before? So I'm conscious of time moving on, and we said we would very much open the floor to questions. And I think you kindly have provided microphones, so I don't know if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. There's a person over there.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that really interesting presentation. It's probably slightly unfair, but I've got two questions for Charles. One somewhat flippant and one more serious. The flippant one is, do you think all prospective permanent secretaries should spend a month working in a CAB then? And the second more serious one is, do you think there is a role for unions and a greater role for unions in helping people in these precarious working conditions, and how might that be fostered?
On the first, there have been various efforts to do that. In the government I was part of, 1997 to 2010, there was a specific move to try and move away from the eminence grise, permanent secretaries moving around, to saying you should have time running agencies, executive agencies, being in localities and so on more. And there has been more exchange of that over time. None of that would cover what I was describing with this particular individual of working in CABs. And I think there is a case for trying to develop that. Of course, many of the individuals concerned have got a lot of voluntary activity in their life and mean different people. But it sounds an almost stupid comment, but there is a Westminster bubble problem. If you went into the Home Office or into the Department for Education when I was the member of the Cabinet there on a Monday morning, they would all be coming in from basically inside the M25, except for 3 or 4 ministers who would be coming in from their constituencies dotted around the country, which had circumstances of the type we're talking about. And I do think that is a problem, that there's it's not so much just a geographical issue of having offices in the north and so on. It's more about the fact that the type of people in those areas just have different types of experiences. One of the reasons why I've always opposed pure proportional representation is I favour the idea a Member of Parliament should have a constituency to which that Member of Parliament is directly accountable and responsible to all the constituents, whether they voted for him or her or not. And I think that's an aspect of our system which not all political systems have. And I think that's very important because it does give the MPs some sense of what's going on. I'm slightly surprised what you said about Brandon Lewis, actually. I'm a political opponent of his, but I would have thought he was a relatively dedicated Yarmouth MP. But it's interesting what you say about the office there. I would say that's atypical. And I certainly wouldn't make, by the way, I wouldn't make a Labour-Tory point about this. I wouldn't say Labour MPs are better or worse than Tories at being responsible for their constituents. But I think people should be. And if you could develop that with permanent secretaries, fine. But I'd also say, echoing Catherine's point at the end, if law students are going through experience which is not just in the ivory tower here, but going to communities around in different areas, I think that's an important thing too. And I think it should be thought about for students, not only in law, but also in other subjects. Could they get experience more widely than simply studying here? Unions, it's a very mixed record. If you look at the union's role in the food industry, which Fiona and Catherine have been describing, it's pretty patchy. It's the reason fundamentally why the legislation for a minimum wage was first passed, and that was very controversial for Labour, and the argument was that from trade unions opposed to the minimum wage was you'd be undermining the role of trade unions, and you needed trade unions to fight for fair wages, and having a statutory intervention that way would make that more difficult. But I don't know, those factories, I wouldn't say the trade unions are able to do very much in reality. It's very difficult for them to get any kind of foothold in. They do exist, and they're well-meaning, but Fiona and Catherine might say better than me about this, about what the position, but I'm a sceptic, actually.
I think it was really interesting when we were looking at, in fact, before the book even, we were looking at the situation of why EU migrant workers were not enforcing their rights in employment tribunals. And one of the pieces of work we did was to try and contact the trade unions to say, let's have a conversation, what role are you playing, what involvement do you have with these groups of workers? And firstly, it was almost impossible to find trade unions who were present.
Exactly.
There was the language barrier, which was very significant. Eventually, I tracked down one union in London who were predominantly Polish-speaking, and they were a branch of a major union. And they were tucked away in a small room in the basement of a building in London. And we had a very fruitful conversation, but they immediately said the problem is we just can't get access to the factories to meet the workers, to be able to recruit them, because the workers don't speak English, we don't have enough language skills to engage them, and the workers themselves are terrified of engaging with the unions. There's a huge fear factor that if they engage with the unions, they will lose their jobs. I think we've seen something of a shift in the trade union profile more recently with some of the small trade unions, the IWGB, the Union of the United Voices of Great Britain, the slightly unusual names of unions, but they are working with people like cycle couriers and Uber drivers and the more precarious workers there, but they're not really being able to access the chicken factories and the more rural agricultural context. And I think that's partly because they're not in London, they're not in the major cities, and language and fear.
I mean, just building up on building on the back of that point, there are, of course, agencies in the UK that are meant to go in and sort some of these things out, but the chance of being visited is incredibly small. The most effective of the agencies that we were aware of is the Gangmasters Licensing and Abuse Authority, which was, in the early days, really quite effective, albeit it's jurisdictionally limited, and by that I mean it can only intervene in respect of certain sectors, and it was set up in the light of the cockle-picking disaster in Morecambe Bay. But when, for all good reason, Theresa May became very interested in modern slavery, its remit was extended to deal with modern slavery, and an extra letter was added to its title, so it became the Gangmasters Licensing and Abuse Authority. But its budget wasn't really expanded, and so a lot of its resource was devoted to dealing with modern slavery, which took it away from what we were seeing in the chicken factories, which isn't modern slavery, but it's a tier down of exploitative and abusive practices. And so what we saw was the absence, it was the sound of silence, it was the absence of trade unions, the absence of any government agencies getting involved. It was the absence of anywhere else to go to. Like the MP was never even mentioned. Now, of course, the EU migrant workers couldn't vote in national elections. They still can't, post the withdrawal agreement. But nevertheless, there was never any of the routes that Charles was describing, which British people might take, would just seem to be closed off to this group. So they became particularly vulnerable. Amelia at the front and the lady at the back. Do you want to go first? Well, you've got the microphone, and then Amelia.
Thank you very much, and thanks for a fascinating panel. My question was really triggered by thinking about the role of Gyros as providing safe advice, and you mentioned in passing advice sharks, which I'd never come across as a concept before, quite frankly. And then you mentioned that the CAB's approach to assurance was basically by protocolizing everything, by the sounds of it. So did you form any conclusions about or recommendations for how you regulate the bottom of the pyramid, and or even just any pros and cons of different approaches to regulation?
Perfect. Yep, thank you for that question. I'll get started on the advice sharks, and then if you want to pick up regulation. So actually, there's quite in all of the, Gyros also work in Ipswich and Suffolk, and we can see a lot of what they call advice shark activity happening.
Explain what
and so that's people kind of working in the community who are charging people sometimes extortionate amounts of money to help them fill out a form, or we saw advice sharks really flourish during COVID-19 actually, because a lot of more mainstream services went online or they had to close for a short time, whereas advice sharks were able to still continue operating in communities, and there was a deadline in which you needed to fulfill your EUSS application. So during that period, they were able to charge people a lot of money to help them make their EUSS application. Some are charging a lot of money and submit a correct application. Some are charging a lot of money and actually causing much bigger problems, and probably is more wasted toward the second as well. So it's a very exploitative practice, but it's very predominant in both Great Yarmouth and in other areas.
I was just going to say, on the back of that, some of the advice sharks are really very dangerous. We got the closest to come to some really quite hairy experience in Ipswich, where the advice shark turned out to be the front for really very serious criminality. And we decided that we're not going to try and do the sort of academic version of the Thursday Murder Club, and we decided at that stage that's where the police and in fact the Home Office got involved, and we explained to them what was going on. It really was quite shocking, the practices that were taking place. But in answer to your question, what do you do about regulating that lower tier? Of course, it's very easy to say, right, they all need to be properly regulated because that will avoid all of these problems. But the risk is, of course, you go into overkill mode. It becomes so bureaucratically heavy that organisations like Gyros, which are operating on a shoestring, end up not being able to do what they do well, because if you apply a full Solicitors Regulatory Authority framework on top. And so your question is it's one we have been thinking about writing on, but we just, at the moment, we haven't come up with a suitable framework. There are 2 or 3 voluntary frameworks out there, which Gyros has signed up to. which already is quite onerous for them. But the reality is the advice shark, by definition, will not sign themselves up to any of these bodies. And then the question is, who's actually going to deal with the advice sharks? If the police get involved, well, that's a good start. But the police are actually more concerned with the background criminality rather than the advice shark conduct. And then there's a sort of grey area in between of people who are giving advice. Jaros is now working with a mosque in Lincoln where the imam is giving advice. Now, in fact, he's not qualified because you're not allowed to give immigration advice without having OISC qualifications. And yet, that's all there is in Lincoln at the moment for lots of people. And he is not an advice shark, but you don't want him to be completely driven out of the system either. So it's complicated and it's difficult. And if there was a simple answer, we would have probably come up with it. But we're thinking quite hard about it. Did you want to?
Just the only small point I was going to add is I thought Fiona's phrase that she used in her presentation, legal advice ecosystem, is an interesting one from that point of view, because certainly when you talk about immigration law, the immigration aspect of this specifically, there's a lot of concern about many of the people giving legal advice on immigration and the difficulty of getting it. When I was talking earlier about my attitude in my own constituency surgeries, there is a real point about where do you start? Who do you suggest people get legal advice from to start going down the process of pursuing legal action? And it's a much more difficult and messy kind of area than I think many people appreciate. Again, I think the book highlights that. But there's a well-documented series of immigration lawyers involved in really serious criminal activity purely as money-making, giving poor advice to people, sending them down different paths, collecting the cash, hopefully from their point of view collecting state cash to help them do it. So it's not even coming just from the person themselves, but also from the state in some form or another. And there's a whole series of complexities here. So I haven't got anything very helpful to add to what Catherine said, but I just wanted to add that angle about immigration lawyers as such.
And I'll just add as well, if that's okay, building on what Sarah said as well, there's a lot of fear. So Jaros encourage people when they have been to an advice shark, gotten terrible advice, and then come to Jaros to try and unpick it. They often encourage people to report that in, but there's a lot of fear people have of actually reporting in that person because that person lives in the same community as they do as well. And as Catherine said, they're very often quite scary people. And Jaros can report in on their behalf, but it doesn't have the same weight to the OISC, the immigration accreditation body, so it's quite difficult to unpick as well.
Amelia, you had a question.
Thank you very much for this very, very important body of research that you're doing, and I think my question would be whether in your research you have seen that perhaps one of the contributing factors of why these routes of assistance are closed to low-paid migrant workers would be the fact that they are coming from legal systems that are very young legal systems, very young democracies, where unions, going to your MP, access to justice concept are just not very embedded in them, perhaps especially in people who were, born pre-90s.
Very, very much so. There was a very real barrier for many people about accessing anything to do with the state. If I can just tell one very funny story. One Saturday night, Catherine and I decided to go to Peterborough, I think, where we knew that there was a Lithuanian mass happening. So we sat at the back, and the priest very kindly said, there's 2 researchers from Cambridge, they'd love to meet with you. They'd be delighted just to talk with you. We stood at the back, and everyone left out the front.
It might have been us, of course.
They might have looked at the 2 of us and thought, not a chance, we're not talking to them. But even the idea of 2 researchers from Cambridge was something that people were not willing to engage with. So then you add into that the idea of going to the MP, anything to do with the state, let alone the courts or a solicitor, and that was really very much a no-go. And we found that particularly for people coming from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the sort of Eastern European view of the state, and there was a very real sense of fear.
My wife's mother was Estonian. She fled Estonia in September 1944 in front of the Russians. And the experience you're describing is absolutely spot on. If you look particularly at the post-1990 period after the end of the Cold War, you could only really describe Lithuania and, to an extent, Latvia as anarchies. And there really was a question of gangs and mob rule and so on. And the struggle that goes on to this day to establish what you might loosely call rule of law still proceeds in those countries. Now, I would say massive progress has been made. I mean, enormous progress has been made in this direction. But the first rule for many of the people that are described in the book is you should have reliance on yourself to try and get out of this mess. You can't rely on either state institutions, or we're talking about trade unions or politicians or the state in any form, or lawyers, to help you really in these circumstances. And that, I think your point's an important insight, that it's a different set of experiences.
And I think in the book as well, in the interviews with people, the role of your work agent was really powerful as well. And that's somebody, an informal agent you've paid in your country of origin to help you move over to the UK. So that's someone often you know from your local community also, and you owe that person a lot of money, and they're quite indebted to people. So we had instances where somebody then decided they didn't want to live in the accommodation the work agent had put in, so they lost their job as well. Or another person had to pay £10 a week not to live in the accommodation that the work agent had organised. So I think that complicates the picture as well, and your kind of legal consciousness of the problem, because it's someone who's also from your own community who's kind of pulling the strings as well. A little bit.
Louise.
Thank you. Hello, is that working? Yes. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about Gyros, and particularly you said, I think, Catherine, that the Gyros staff had come on the same journey. So, I mean, I'd already written down, who works for Gyros, who are these people? So that's sort of one question. And I suppose the other one, I mean, you said it was on the shoestring, and I'm sure it is, but how is it funded, and just a bit more about the structure of it, because we all know about Citizens Vice Bureaus and so on, but we don't really know about this. There's a network of these kinds of organisations.
Yeah. So thank you for that. So Gyros is a relatively small organisation. Most of its staff are EU migrant workers. Its chief executive is a phenomenon, and it's got an incredibly supportive board of trustees. There is a well-recognised route of first job, which is sort of any job with the aspiration of moving up to a better job, and then your best job. For many people, it's not a reality because they don't have the language skills. And that's why working in chicken factories is at least a first job, and a lot of them stay there because they never learn enough English. You might have seen that slide which showed how low levels of English they were. It's not, they often spoke a number of languages. They would often speak Russian, Lithuanian, some Polish. It depended on what the factory line you're on, what language you actually learnt, but none of it was English because there are just no native English speakers working in these factories. But so for some of them, including the woman who drew the front cover of our book, that's her, isn't it? It's her smoking at the front. But she's a Gyros advisor, and in fact she came with a master's degree in linguistics from Lithuania. And her first job, indeed, was in a chicken factory, but she then, a lot of them start volunteering at Gyros. When they've gone to Gyros to get help themselves, then they want to give something back and they volunteer, and then they become paid staff, often on part-time contracts. And where does Gyros get its money from?
So Gyros, at any time, so we interviewed the chief exec as well, I think at any time, they're running about 40 different funding pots, from big and from small. I think it's a constant. She doesn't work full time, but it's a constant process of applying for funding, and thinking up new projects and trying to bring the funding in. And just on Gyros as well. So I mentioned it was founded in 1998 in the town in Great Yarmouth, and it was founded at the time because London boroughs were placing asylum seekers into the town at the time because accommodation was cheap. So local people could see that this new group of people were in the town and they needed some support. So they founded Gyros, and then it changed with the times and with the migration phases that it was seeing. So as Catherine said, then EU nationals became the biggest client group afterwards that they were needing to support, and it kind of formalised as time went on. But there's a lot of plate spinning involved in the funding, it seemed, a lot of...
And there's a sad footnote to all of this, which is that throughout all the time we were doing the research, apart from COVID, they did drop-ins on a Tuesday in the closed-down Debenham store, which is right in the centre of Great Yarmouth. And then following the riots that you saw in the summer and the hostility towards migrant workers, which got worse, well, for the reasons that we all know, and again, the anti-asylum rhetoric, albeit, of course, most of their clients are EU migrants, not asylum seekers. Gyros has now stopped doing drop-ins. It's deemed just not safe enough for them to even do that. The pictures you saw of people sitting behind a desk, that's been stopped. And now individuals have got to make appointments, which promptly puts up further barriers, because if you don't have the English language skills or the organisational skills to make an appointment and to be there at a particular date, it means that they're less likely to seek advice. And so that atmosphere is actually having, I mean, of course, many impacts, but a day-to-day impact on the individuals, and particularly on Gyros.
And as well, when people are working very unknown shifts at the factory, you know, planning to get to an appointment, it sounds so easy for us, doesn't it? You ring up, you book it, and you attend. Well, for these people, the ringing up and booking is the hard bit, but even attending is hard, because they might be phoned half an hour beforehand and say you're working, and they've got to attend, otherwise they will not get future shifts.
The lady there, and then the lady here.
I have a question about what draws the migrants to come to this country to be so marginalized, because are they misled?
I think, yes, so as I said, I think kind of local employment needs, I think, really drove these phases of migration that we saw. And a good example of it is Bernard Matthews, who was one of the big kind of poultry employers locally for Great Yarmouth, set up a recruitment office in Lisbon during a time of great unemployment in Portugal, and were able to recruit, I think they reported recruiting thousands of people to come and move over, particularly for their Christmas kind of turkey campaigns. And they would place people in what used to be hotel accommodation in the town. And that kind of started that kind of route of migration for people from Portugal. And then other agents started working in other European countries to similarly bring people over to work. And there's a really large number of poultry factories in and around, like an hour from Great Yarmouth, so huge employment needs. And I think that although work conditions and housing conditions are very poor, on the whole, people are being paid, even if a big chunk of it is being taken by the agent. So you have an opportunity to come over and to earn money and to take as many shifts as you can, etc. So I think that drives a lot of it.
And of course, for many migrants, also being able to repatriate the money they make to their country of origin. If you look at the economic development of Poland, for example, a lot of it was funded by people who came and worked here and were able to use their wages to do that. And I'm sure that's true in Lithuania and Latvia as well. But you're fundamentally right. I think people don't know what they're coming to. And I've always felt what I would call them criminal people trafficking gangs essentially have a very successful business model, i.e. charging enormous amounts of money, which you've just referred to in terms of those relationships still coming through now, and essentially a risk-free, the law enforcement has not been able to tackle it. And one of the ironies of the EU Brexit decision is the links between the British police and security organisations and the ones in other countries is now much weaker than it was, so data can't be shared and so on and so forth. And you really need an international policing effort to attack that criminality.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this really important research with us. I was wondering a bit more about the legal status and the relevance of the legal status on precarity. For example, how visa regimes have an impact on precarity, and I was specifically thinking about visas which are, for example, tied to employers or even tied to spouses, which then can also create like gendered dependencies. And I was wondering whether you can share anything on that.
Say something about the we have to talk about the
The visa. EUSS, yes.
Yeah, so just how it works. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Post-Brexit, UK government was required under the withdrawal agreement to set up a scheme to ensure that all EU nationals and their family members, who are not necessarily EU nationals, could register themselves here. There are two types of registration: EU pre-settled status and EU settled status. And what we've seen in our data is that a lot of the Gyros clients ended up with EU pre-settled status, which is an inferior status to have. It's harder to get benefits than if you get settled status. And then at the moment, you're meant to apply to upgrade at the end of 5 years to settled status. There was a challenge brought by the IMA, the Independent Monitoring Authority, to the legality of the requirement to upgrade, and the High Court gave a very strong judgment that said this requirement to upgrade was contrary to the withdrawal agreement. But the UK government is struggling to put this into operation. And so it keeps kicking the can down the road. Currently, it's given people an extra 2 years under pre-settled status before they have to apply for settled status, but that's still a requirement to apply. They talk about a digital footprint, and if you've got a digital footprint, the government itself might upgrade you to settled status. But that is fine for people who work in universities where there's an HR system and they're paying taxes. It's not fine for people who are working in chicken factories, or more realistically in fields, and the fact that the farms around Great Yarmouth, because their work is peripatetic, probably some of it cash in hand, and it's very difficult for them to create this constant digital footprint. We went out to strawberry field, Sharrington's, up in North Norfolk, to meet and interview some of the pickers who'd come from mainly Bulgaria. There were some from Ukraine. And it's interesting. They were living in caravans, and they showed off their caravans. But again, they were very disengaged with the state. The reason why we were actually there was because Gyros had been asked to translate for them to try and persuade them to have their COVID vaccines. And it was interesting that we've had terrible difficulty actually getting physical access to farms because the owners are very reluctant to talk to us. But this farm clearly were proud of what they offered because they did let us in. And the workers, but we're just so completely separated from British society. But the point is, the idea that they would understand about applying for pre-settled status or settled status was just for the birds.
We actually couldn't get the bus to the farm because the roads were too small and there's no public transport. So they really are, and the farm workers aren't allowed to have a car each because there isn't space for everyone to park it. So you really are stuck in the middle of nowhere in Norfolk. Yeah.
And the idea that any of those workers would receive pay slips or tenancy agreements or any of the documentation that you need for your EUSS application is laughable. So if you'd say to them, can you prove that you've been in the UK for a certain length of time, they literally have nothing.
Just take the last question, and then we the lady there. Forgive me. Sorry, Pippa, and then excuse me, if you could just the lady here in the black top.
Thinking of this from a non-legal way, it seems to me that we have accreditation schemes for the welfare of animals in the supply chain, but we do not have an accreditation scheme for the welfare of the people who are creating our food. Is there something more that we could do to put pressure on Bernard Matthews or Tesco's or wherever these goods end up, as we would in modern slavery, in creation of clothes, to make sure that they are responsible for the way in which the workers who've created the goods have been looked after?
I'm sure there's a lot we could do in relation to sort of corporate social responsibility, but I think our view really is that we need a labour inspectorate. If you look at how labour rights are enforced in the UK, it doesn't work for people who are low-paid, vulnerable, precarious workers. And actually what we need is a government body with joined-up thinking who go in and enforce those rights. Or a mechanism that says we have a tribunal claim over here for national minimum wage or holiday pay. Now let's check whether that organisation is actually paying holiday pay for everybody, because one of the things we identified very quickly was that there were certain organisations and who were saying, well, the not paying holiday pay is our profit margin. So if one person even enforced it, there should be some connection that says now we're going to check for everybody else. But I think our view throughout was that we actually need a much more joined up state enforcement body, particularly for those low-level violations, if I can put it that way. They're serious, they're important, but they're not modern slavery. And we need someone who can actually engage with that.
And you're right, Pippa. These chicken factories are supplying the big supermarkets. They're supplying the Tesco's. But what was interesting is that there is no sense that Tesco's is actually doing the supply chain due diligence. Now, presumably, must be because they make a big point about it. But it is we've the next stage of the project. One of the things that we have done is we're starting to interview those in the food sector. We had an interesting interview recently with the chief executive of one of the growers associations, and he was adamant that the supermarkets are doing a very good job, but that's not what we're seeing on the ground, and we're trying to work out why there is that dichotomy.
There is a great deal of argument and discussion about it. I fundamentally agree that a strong labour inspectorate is the core to this, and indeed the International Labour Organisation would argue that as well. I would also say that even the government of which I was a part, we did nothing like enough in this. Things like the Gangmasters Act, which is described by Catherine, was a response to a particular disaster rather than a generalised approach to trying to enforce labour regulation in an effective way. It's important to say it's a very politically contested area. There are lots of people, not least the corporations, who want to minimise by all means possible the amount of engagement in their operations. But I would say that governments have to resist that and be much stronger, but in fact they haven't been, and there's a lot of reasons one can discuss for that. I think the other interesting point on this is the supply chain point. I remember going into a potato shed on a farm in Norfolk, where the person who owned the land showed me all the different potatoes, very carefully regulated. Some were for Tesco's, others were for Co-op and so on. And I was very surprised actually to see there was that level of control by the supermarket on the quality of the potato, which would end up in their particular supermarket chains. And in fact, the farmer concerned was complaining to me about this being the problem of being a potato person. And I think there's a whole set of issues here which are very, very important. But getting a widespread, proper public debate about it is the kind of thing which this kind of book hopefully can promote.
Thank you. Shall I just take the last question?
Thank you very much for all the insightful conversations. I was just wondering, because obviously a lot of these workers, they migrate with their families, including their children. From my experience, I've noticed a lot of migrant workers migrating specifically with the purpose of giving their children better opportunities at education and further down the line. But obviously, if the parent is not as educated or not as fluent in English, then the children also would not be very easily integrated into those spaces, into schools. Obviously, they can pick it up potentially a bit quicker, but I was wondering if we had any sort of understanding of where those children actually end up and how they are being supported in the education system, because I imagine if a child is suddenly moved from one country to another, I am not entirely sure if there is any system in place for them to be able to be integrated into a school easily, instead of essentially just being dropped into it and told to figure it out.
I would say generally, British schools have been working very hard on this for a period of, I would say, 40 or 50 years. When my children went to school in Hackney, there were up to 50 or 60 languages spoken in the school. And the question of integration, which you correctly mentioned, was absolutely top of the school's agenda as to how it developed. There were particular funding streams to try and assist this and so on. and my own view, but you may think it's complacent, is that for a considerable amount of time, there have been efforts to ensure that primary schools in particular are able to ensure that people are integrated and able to move forward. Whether that's flexible enough to deal with the changes in migrant population is a good question. But I think the issue you raise is relatively well understood. And I'm sure I'll now be contradicted.
So it seems, I mean, across the board, it seems children pick up, they go to school and they pick up the language, the local language very quickly. And actually, you see a different issue there where you have children interpreting on behalf of their parents in health appointments, etc., where they shouldn't be, and it's not appropriate for them to be. We did interview some younger people, one of whom he'd been to 2 different schools. One school he had a really terrible time when he first moved over, and he was bullied, and there was quite a lot of racist bullying also. But he was moved to a second school where there was an English language as an additional language support person who had that role, and he reports she made a huge difference to his school experience and to his ability to learn English, and he kind of flourished since in that position. So I think it's varied, but children do tend to pick up the language a lot more, obviously more quicker than the parents do. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to thank you very much, and thank in particular Charles for offering his views. I want to thank you all enormously for giving up your time to come here this afternoon. There are drinks outside. There are some copies of the book if you would be interested. I feel somewhat embarrassed even to say that. But,
Go.
But on that, may I wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.